Hello, Garland Nixon here, and things are kind of looking bleak for Ukraine on the battlefield, and there's a lot going on around that. Let's talk. Hello, Garland here, and let me just give you an example of what's happening. Let me give you an example here of what we're looking at on pretty much a daily basis, almost. Russian troops capture another key Donbass stronghold. The village of Elcharatino has been described as a major logistics hub for Ukrainian troops in the area. It's described by the Russians, so we'll take that with a grain of salt, but as a strategically important village. The Russian center group of forces had completely liberated the settlement as a result of active battle actions. So here's the bottom line. What we're looking at now, let's get into it. What we're looking at now is the slow-mo collapse of the Ukrainian military. Let me put it a different way. The Ukrainian project. This is the Ukrainian project. So just so for those of you, and I'm sure there's few who don't know what I mean when I say the Ukrainian project, quite simple. The Ukrainian project is for the U.S. empire to overthrow the government of Ukraine, which they were successful at doing, to install a puppet regime, which they were successful in doing, to utilize to expand the anti-Russian fervor amongst the fascists in Ukraine, to expand the governmental and military authority of the same fascist, right? So take over Ukraine, bring these fascists to the forefront, put them on the leading edge of the political front, the leading edge of the military front, and then utilize their hatred for Russia against them, right? Because, I mean, if you tell me, Garland, you've got to get in the ring and fight a bear, then I got to be either pretty stupid or pretty angry or something like that. I can't be in my right mind because I'm not going to defeat the bear. So what they had to do is they had to get these people in a mindset that said, we believe that we can defeat the bear. And of course, we believe that at some point, if we have trouble with the bear, that you're going to come in and help us defeat the bear, right? So they had to prop these people up mentally, politically, militarily, to a point where they believed that they had a chance at defeating the Russian military. They never did. And of course, the Ukrainian project, actually, the biggest part of it was going to be economical. And of course, again, I'm just reviewing this stuff, so don't get bored for those that know it all. That already know it. And that was, we're going to weaken Russia. We're going to utilize this. We're going to kick this war off against Russia. Then, of course, we're going to institute sanctions against Russia, which will weaken Russia. Even more importantly, it will cut the economic links between Europe and Russia, which will also weaken Europe. Europe is seen by the neocons as an economic challenger. Right. So you got to weaken Russia, you're going to weaken Europe, and you're going to make Europe more subservient to you, which will come in handy because you're going to use them as cannon fodder, either in a war against Russia or certainly in your next war against China. And of course, economic cannon fodder, because you're going to really hurt their economy when you separate them from Russia. You're going to wipe out their economy when you separate them from China, but who cares, because they'll be subservient to you and you can sell them lots of stuff and make money. And basically the U.S. empire, I think, recognized to some extent that it was crumbling economically, and they were going to, like a vampire, feed off the blood of Europe. Right. So a big part of this whole Ukraine project was the weakening of Europe, the economic destabilization of Europe, and then feeding off the economic blood of Europe to revitalize, to strengthen the U.S. empire, which is crumbling. Okay, so the project started to fall apart when the economic sanctions of Russia didn't work. So at that point, they had to regroup and say, okay, the economic sanctions from Russia didn't work. So what we'll continue to do is we will, and they had mentioned this previously, and that was to turn Ukraine into, effectively Russia's second Afghanistan, where the Russians will get bogged down in their fighting and it will weaken them, the people, at home. Well, if the economic sanctions don't work, then being bogged down in Ukraine for many, many years, that'll work. The people will get upset, the game plan, right? And then they all show up on Red Square in some kind of Maidan-esque kind of George Soros supported a protest, and Putin gets overthrown, and then the West comes in and divvies up all the Russian, natural resources. Okay, there. So all of that's laid out. Well, the part that they hadn't planned on was that the Russians would be strong enough to withstand, to take the first blow, economic blow, right, and then to regroup and to come back and deliver a knockout punch militarily. And basically, I'm just summing it up. The Russians took an economic blow. Again, I always go back to this. Vladimir Putin is a martial artist. A martial artist has to learn how to take a punch. A martial artist, anyone who's learning self-defense has to understand. You watch movies and nobody gets hit. They block punches, they kick, they beat up their opponent. You watch a fight, some guy blocks the punches and he beats up the other guy. People don't take punches much in the movies. In real life, you're going to get hit, and you have to be ready to take a punch, take a hit. In fact, if there's an edged weapon, sometimes when you're fighting a person or you're defending yourself from an edged weapon, you may say, I'm going to get cut here or here, but I'm not going to let them get to a vital organ, right? And so you may have to block, and you may have to take a cut on an arm or something else because you're protecting a vital organ. But whatever the case, you're trying to come out of that fight alive, right? You're not trying. You don't think you're going to come out of it unscathed. And I think that's part of the Russian military. It's to understand we can take a blow, take attack and counter it, take a hit and counterattack, right? Take an economic hit. They got themselves together. They gave themselves some time to crank up their industrial capacity. Boom, we're ready to punch. And basically, the time period from February of 2022 till now is basically the Russians regrouping, continuing to fight while they regroup, but doing the same things doing both regrouping and fighting while they regroup. Getting themselves together and fighting as they get themselves together, as they strengthen themselves, as they increase their industrial and military capacity. So bottom line, that all that happened, worked in the best interest of the Russians. Part of it is this, let's not forget, and this is a critical part of all of this conversation, is all of this is occurring on the Russian border. No matter what we talk about when it comes to the Ukraine conflict, always remember the foundation of this whole conflict, of everything going on, is that it's happening on the Russian border, which means the Russians are in a defensive stance. They're defending their border, and they have the added advantage of not needing much of supply lines, of being able to fire weapons from within the safety of their own airspace, right? So they have a tremendous advantage because they're fighting on their border. They can fire out of their airspace. They can their supply lines really don't start until they get to the Ukraine border. If you think about this, the supply lines for Ukraine start in the United States. Sometimes they start in South Korea. Sometimes they actually started in Israel, where some of the shells were bought in Israel. So you've got Ukraine whose supply lines are halfway around the world in various different countries. The Russian supply lines don't even start until they get to the Russian border. So sometimes their supply lines might be 50 or 100 kilometers long, if that, sometimes 10 or 20, sometimes virtually no supply lines, because they have people protecting their border from Ukrainian infiltration. Okay, so they've got this tremendous advantage there, and they're going to take advantage of every, they're going to utilize every advantage they have. So we get here, and what could have been predicted, and was in fact predicted by me and a lot of other people, Scott Ritter, and that is that at some point you start seeing a collapse. And, I put it like this. When you say collapse, people think of like a debacle, right? A sudden collapse, a sudden, not necessarily a sudden catastrophic collapse, right? Well, if you look at things historically, right, where we may say, okay, there was it was a slow motion collapse. But when they write the history books 50 years from now and they say that collapse happened over a 6-month period, that ain't slow motion. You know, you can see when people talk about 1945, right? Well, they talk about the year 1945 is the year that the Great Patriotic War, as the Russians call it, ended. We call it World War II, but that's the year that it ended. But it was a lot of fighting and it was a long year, but we just say 1945. The Germans collapsed. The Germans were defeated in 1945. We just use the year as reference. So that's a 12-month period. So the Germans were defeated over of course of years, but we actually spread it out to 1945 the same way. Eventually, people will say, well, 2024, that's the year that the Ukrainians collapsed, their lines collapsed in the spring and summer of 2024. It'll be verbally a compact period of time, right? So right now, what we're seeing is this, and this is the key tell. I mean, if you look at what happened in World War II, what did the Russians do? As they went across Eastern Europe, I think it was 1,842 or 1,846 towns and villages that they took. That's what they did, bit by bit. You know, they pound their enemy in front of with artillery and they advance. They advance, right? Well, that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing those towns and villages where the Russian style of fighting is, we'll take this town, we'll secure it. Okay, we got that, we'll secure it. We'll take the next town and secure it. We'll take the next town and secure it. Well, that's what they've been doing all along. But now, it's not that I'll put it like this. I understand the Russians are doing some offensive operations, but I think it's this. It's not that the Russians are in a much bigger hurry. It's that the Ukrainians are weaker. They're getting weaker and weaker and weaker. Most importantly, they're running out of personnel. But even that, if they had the personnel, their sponsor, their master, now has another war. And if you were the U.S. empire and you had to choose which is more important, bad news for Ukraine. It ain't Ukraine, because Ukraine was a folly. Ukraine was a project that they elected to move on. Okay, let's do this and we'll take out Russia. However, Israel, that is their base. That is, as they refer to it, that is your unsinkable aircraft carrier. That is their military base in the Middle East. And if they lose their military base in the Middle East, I mean, for a number of reasons, not the least of which being they won't have the military and intelligence collections operations that they need in that area to try to do all of their dirty work. But the humiliation. They lose that, the world's going to look at them and say, you're weak. And any so-called allies or puppets or whatever are going to look at them and say, you're weak. And they'll be right, because they are weaker than they were before. I'll put it like this. To some extent, the U.S. is weaker. To another extent, the other countries out here are getting more powerful. The U.S. is falling behind technologically. And as a society, it's coming unglued. And it's hard to maintain a powerful military presence when your economy and your society is coming unglued. It's coming apart at the seams, right? And the people internally, as Jody Braw always says, the people internally are unhappy. You can't go out and defend your country. You can't go out and launch all kind of military assaults around the world and do all this other stuff if you don't deliver it home. And not only do they not deliver it home, they are preying. The U.S. government is preying on its citizens. So its citizens are furious, unhappy. The country's unstable. So now what they're trying to do is they're trying to be an aggressive, assertive empire in a nation that's unstable. The empire is unstable and it's still trying to be an empire. It ain't working out well. So when we get back to Ukraine, what do we have? We had a couple things happen, and this was important, and that was the U.S. started giving everything to Israel and nothing to Ukraine. And initially the response from Zelensky and the Ukrainians were, hey, we want the same stuff you're giving Israel, right? And he even said when the U.S. and NATO defended Israel against the Iranian, technological demonstration, we'll call it, Zelensky came out and said, hey, why can't you defend us like you defend Israel? And if they were honest, they'd say, because you are a luxury folly project. They ain't. They are an integral part of the empire and have been ever since we took that project over from the British Empire, right? So you're a folly. You're something we want to do. You're a luxury. You're the side chick. Israel's the wife. You're the side chick. They can get another side chick. They don't want to let go of their wife. They don't want to lose their wife, but they can always get another. They already got other side chicks. Yeah, you're a hot, important side chick, but you ain't that important to them when it comes down to it. If they got to make decisions, the side chick goes first, and the wife stays around. So as of now, if it wasn't bad enough for Ukraine that the U.S. empire and its allies were having difficulties building the amount of weaponry they need, now the allocation of weaponry now has to be triaged, shall we say. So it'll go to the most of their allies. And clearly that's Israel. So they're, as my dad would use this term, they're sucking hind tit to Israel, basically, in a nutshell. They're done. They're screwed. So Russia is now doing what they do. They're knocking off one town after another. And what's going on here is this. Look, if I know that Israel, that Ukraine, the Ukrainian military is falling apart and being knocked out, being swept up, then of course the people in the Pentagon know it. Now, of course, the neocons, Biden and those guys, they'll believe whatever works for them. These are sociopaths. These are people who, I'll put it like this: read a great book called Voltaire's Bastards and you'll understand. They create a system and they operate within that system, within that political and economic and diplomatic system. And all of the things in that system have to be true. So they have to believe them, even when reality doesn't present itself in the manner that that aligns with their narrative. They cannot afford intellectually, philosophically, right, emotionally, they can't afford to accept that their narrative no longer applies. So they just have to say, yeah, this is true, even though as it crumbles around them, right? They have to Baghdad Bob this thing. So they're basically, and let me add this, and they got the Europeans, because they've dragged the Europeans, out on the edge of this cliff, and the European leadership is like, hey, what are we going to do? And U.S. neocons are like, hey, what do you mean we? You're the one that's screwed. Or what do we do? How about some cannon fodder? And you're looking like some good cannon fodder. Now, here's what's important, I think. There are people now saying, look, there's some operation on Russia's border, right near Russia's border, that the U.S. empire is contemplating going into Ukraine and fighting Russia. I'm not going to say that ain't going to happen, but I don't think they are. I think they understand that to do that they don't have the horsepower to do it. That they can't, if they get in that fight, they can't, let's say right now, they say, okay, look, Ukraine's falling, we're going to get in this thing and we're going to fight. And it's going to be intense, right? Well, Israel's going to run short of weapons real quick, aren't they? They're going to run. Now, what happens when they run out of anti-aircraft missiles? Because they're pretty much almost out of them now. So they got to go fight Russia with a week's worth of anti-aircraft missiles. And they're going to get into this battle, not to mention this. Well, to mention it, I'm going to say not to mention, but we must mention this. I remember listening to Professor, and I believe this, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs was talking about Europe, and he said, some people, he had gotten it from reliable sources, that the question went around to a number of European leaders and said, hey, if we're sending troops to fight in Ukraine, to fight the Russians, how many troops can you spare? And almost to a man and woman, they said none. Because if we send troops into Russia, our government will fall. See, that's the part of it that has to be considered. And that is, for Biden to send troops in, it'd be hard for him to do that one, to use the AUMF, the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, which was supposedly to fight terrorism. He couldn't really use that and say, we're going to go in and fight the Russians in Ukraine. He'd have to go to Congress, and then he would have a fight on his hands, an ugly fight. And but not only that, if he did that, you'd be screaming to the Russians, hey, we're coming in. You think if Congress says, okay, you think the Russians are going to wait for you to throw the first punch? If the Congress says okay, and Joe Biden says okay, we're sending them in, you think Russia's going to sit there and wait for you? All right, well, go ahead and form all your guys and out and come on. And no, they're not. They're going to hit every base, every port. They're going to make sure that you ain't coming in there, healthy. It's going to be real problematic for you to do that, and I don't think that one goes through Congress, because that's World War III, and the people in America are already unhappy. Not to mention the U.S. doesn't have the wherewithal to do it, and they would start Europe would erupt, and they know it. They know that would be a bridge too far, and Europe would erupt, and governments would fall, and that would be the last straw. So I think they understand that there are some limitations. And they also understand that they're in a jam in the Middle East. They're in a hell of a jam. They're in a hell of a mess. So will the NATO come into Ukraine? I'm going to say what I've been saying all along. If they could, they would. They can't, they won't. I don't believe they will. I think they understand they can't. Militarily, they can't. Politically, they can't. There are those who disagree with me. I love Mark Sloboda. He's a good friend, a great brother. And he believes they will, and we'll find out. I believe they won't. He believes what he says is, oh yeah, NATO will be in there fighting within a year. First of all, they're already in there fighting. The French are sending people in. I believe they'll continue their clandestine methods of sending troops and things like that in. But the open warfare, I don't see that happening. I've said this all along. What these people tend to do is when their friends get in a jam, they leave them hanging out to dry. And then at some point, the Ukrainians wake up and say, we've been had by the United States, and they turn on the United States, and they're pissed at the US, not the Russians. That's what's coming. But right now, what we're looking at is town after town falling. And see, what I think happens at some point is and you're seeing this start in areas now. You're starting to see areas where the Ukrainian leadership will say to a brigade, a division, whatever, okay, guys, hold your ground right there. And they'll be like, you got to be kidding me. There's 150,000 Russians coming, and we got 5,000 guys here, and they're dropping bombs on us every day. Oh, hell no, we're out. They're done, because it would just be suicide, right? There are other times when they'll say to this, look, we want you to advance over to this town over there. The Russians are going to take the town. We want you to go help hold them off. And you've got, particular units saying, you expect us to go over there where bombs are dropping and artillery day and night and charge into that mess and just get torn to shreds and killed because it'll hold the Russians off for another 4 days? Yeah, I don't think that's happening. Nope. And so you're starting to have, you got a military where you're starting to have the people in a military who don't see the logic in the orders that they are being given. Now, in the military, you don't have to see the logic in the orders that you're given. You just carry them out. But not only do they not see the logic, they don't see the ultimate strategy, and they're losing trust in their leadership, and they're starting to feel as though they're being thrown into the battle to just, get wiped out, that their leadership has no concern for their lives, and that their leadership doesn't even have a plan to win, that they are fighting and dying in a war of futility, and they are right. So I think the direction we're moving in now, as the Russians take town after town after town, is a direction where the Ukrainian military becomes unstable and unable to continue fighting. Wherein, I've said this long ago, look, when you talk about NATO sending people in, right, they got to have somebody to support. Okay, we've got the Ukrainian military, because what do they keep saying? We will go in and we will fight behind the lines and make it easier for the Ukrainians to go fight on the front lines. And the Russians are saying, if you're behind the lines, beside the lines, over the lines, under the lines, anywhere, if you come to Ukraine, we're going to blast the hell out of you. So what they're trying to do is slice the salami a little bit thinner, right? We're going to send bombs so we're not participants in the war, right? We're going to help with targeting, but we're not participants in the war. We're going to have troops on the ground operating some of the weaponry, but we're not a participant to the war, right? This closer and closer. Now we have troops on the ground, but they're not fighting. They are working in the background, doing other logistics things. Therefore, we're not part. You know what I mean? Closer and closer and closer and closer. So basically, they want their cake and eat it too, as we say here in the U.S., right? They want to be able to send their troops in to support the Ukrainian troops as close as they can to the battle line, and then still claim that they're not part of the fight. And the Russians are saying, if you come to Ukraine, you're part of the fight. If you come in here, you can say you're not part of the fight. Ukrainians can say you're not part of the fight. You will be targeted and you will be eliminated. So that's up to you. That's your rhetorical position. We're going to fire on you. Basically, you may have a rhetorical position that you may feel that you can strongly defend that you're not part of this fight. But if you set foot in Ukraine, we're going to fire on you. We're not going to have a discussion about whether you're part of the fight or not. We're not going to have some kind of a esoteric discussion about what constitutes, actually supporting the fight versus being engaged in the fight. We ain't having that conversation. You come in Ukraine, we're going to fire on you. That's the Russians' position. You do let your conscience be your guide. You can talk it about amongst yourselves. You can write articles for the Washington Post that says we're not part of the fight. We're just going in there to blah, blah, blah. If you step foot in Ukraine, we're going to fire on you. And you will be a priority target. And the Russians understand that they have no choice but to do that. Because if NATO puts 1,000 troops in and you don't fire on them, they'll put in another 1,000. They'll put in 10,000. They'll keep putting stuff in. Until before you know it, they're like, yeah, we got a full presence in there. Well, no, if you send one person in there, the Russians are going to fire on them. It's a strategic decision that they've made. So you got to make a strategic decision as to whether or not you're sending people in. That's the position that they've taken. And I think because, again, we got to keep remembering this. This is on the Russian border. The U.S. empire has elected to go to the Russian border and fight the Russians with a proxy military. If you think about this, the U.S. empire has decided to go to the borders of a world power, Taiwan. The U.S. empire says we're going to go to the borders of a world power. Now, from the perspective of the U.S. empire, that is a weak spot. That is your soft underbelly, right? We can't. It would be problematic for us to just militarily confront you. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to your border and we're going to pick a fight. We're going to say Ukraine is a priority for Russia, so we'll pick our fight in Ukraine. Taiwan is a priority for China, so we'll pick our fight in Taiwan. So from one perspective of the neocons, it allows them to go to the border of their adversary and pick a fight and maintain some level of plausible not deniability. No, Russia and China, we're not here to pick a fight with you. We're just here to protect democracy. It just happens to be on your border. But because we're for helping democracy and these poor downtrodden people who are being mistreated by you, and they just happen to be on your border, coincidentally, we'll help them out. And, you're bad guys. You don't have a sphere of influence in your border. There are terms. There's a physical border, but then great powers have a strategic border, right? The U.S. claims a strategic border. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. says no one in the Western Hemisphere. See, our strategic border is the entire hemisphere. No one in the Western Hemisphere can make a military alliance. Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, none of you guys can have a military alliance outside of this hemisphere unless we say so. So the U.S. recognizes that there are strategic borders and exercises authority over their strategic border. But what they say is nobody else has a strategic border except us, because we are the hegemonic unipolar power in the world. Now, what Russia is saying is, yeah, well, that ain't going to work. And if, it's like a person saying to me, Garland, you got to move. And I say, I'm not getting out of this chair. I said, you got to move out of this chair. So move. And I say, well, you can get me out of this chair, but you're going to have to fight to do it. Right? I can make that statement. Garland, you've got to stop doing this. And I can say, well, I don't plan to stop doing it. You can get me to stop doing it. Sure. But you got to fight to do it. If you want to fight, let's fight. And if you win, then I guess I got to stop doing it. If you lose, I don't. But you're going to have to fight to get your way. You're going to have to kinetically, you're going to have to force your will on me. If you think you can do it, let's go. If you don't think you can do it, then maybe it ain't, that maybe the squeeze ain't worth the juice, as they say, right? So the U.S. empire was accustomed to going wherever, doing whatever. And they went to the Russian border after doing whatever, wherever. And they said to the Russians, we're taking Ukraine. We got Ukraine. Now we're going to set it up, and now we're going to have a proxy war on your border. And the Russians said, well, get out of Ukraine and make Ukraine a what did they call it? Kind of like uh, a borderland that is not militarized. And the U.S. and NATO and its allies all said, no, we're going to stay in Ukraine. And Russia said, well, you can stay in Ukraine, but you're going to have to fight to stay in Ukraine. Kind of like what the resistance is saying to Israel. You can continue to occupy Palestine. You can do that. You got the U.S. military, you got NATO and all these other people on your side. Sure, you can stay in, you continue to occupy Palestine. You can occupy the Golan Heights. You can occupy all that stuff, but you're going to have to fight to do it. See, there's a difference. That is the difference now that we're starting to see as other great powers arise, and as resistance to the U.S. empire rises around the world. It comes down sooner or later. If the U.S. empire and its machinations and its forces and its puppets all decide that they're going to go wherever and do whatever, when the people in the region say you can do it, but you're going to have to fight to do it, that changes the equation. And what they're seeing is multiple regions are saying that. Now, the resistance forces in West Asia, in the Middle East, are saying you can stay in Palestine, U.S., but you got to fight to stay here. So let's do this and see how it works out. Yemen, yeah, you can continue to, genocide the Palestinians, but you have to fight, and you're going to have to struggle in the Red Sea in order to do it. Okay, so you can do what you got to do, but you're going to have to. You're not going to do it without a fight, right? You ain't going to do that. You're not going to just walk in and walk out unscathed. If you want to fight, yeah, this is where things are different. Because see, what the U.S. empire would do would just threaten. We're going to do this. Well, we don't want you to shut up or we'll kill you and overthrow your government. And people were afraid. They didn't have the power. They didn't have the wherewithal to resist. Now there are resistance forces that have the technological, military, diplomatic, political backing, support, bricks, all that stuff. Enough to say, now we can finally say to the U.S. empire, you can accomplish your goals. You can continue with your goals, but you're going to have to fight the whole time to do it. That's what it comes down to. And it's getting there with China. Hopefully that can be avoided. I don't know if it can or not. Hopefully the U.S., to some extent, I felt like U.S. imperialism was going to die on the steps of Ukraine. Now, U.S. imperialism is dying in the steps of Gaza, because what the ruling elite always fear the most is internal uprising. That's how they fall. That's how they get their heads cut off, right? That's where the guillotines come out. So their big fear is materializing on the college campuses. U.S. imperialism is dying on the college campuses of the United States. It's dying in the rubble in Gaza, and of course, it's getting slapped around pretty good on the steps of Ukraine, right? So now it looks to me as though the Russians are going to move. What's interesting, and they're going to continue to move. They're on the move. What's interesting is Alexander Mercouris talked about the bridges that cross the Dnieper River. And he says, it's interesting that the Russians haven't blown them. I think all along, it is a wise strategic move not to attack them. Because if they attack the bridges, it gives, right now, I'll put it like this. Right now, the U.S. empire doesn't know what the Russians are going to do next. Are they going to turn? Are they going to take Kharkov? Are they going for Kiev? Are they going to cross the bridges in the west Ukraine? What are they going to do? If, in fact, the bridges were all blown, then you could look at it and say, okay, they want to trap the Ukrainian army back up against the river and annihilate them or whatever, take everything on this side of the river. It kind of reveals their hand if they blow the bridges. I think strategically it's wise not to blow the bridges, because you leave your adversary constantly thinking, why the hell aren't they blowing the bridges? Are they going to come across? Not to mention, all along, you've got the Ukrainians who are getting backed up closer and closer and closer to the river, thinking, and that because here's an option. Instead of blowing the bridges now, you keep pushing the Ukrainian troops back closer and closer to the river, right? So you got this river sitting over here, right? And the Ukrainian troops are spread out all over the place. You hit them town after town, and they start getting closer and closer and closer till you got all of them concentrated along the river. right? They blow all these towns, and what happens when the Russians take a bunch of towns and villages, right? The Ukrainians fall back and regroup. They take these towns and villages, they fall back and regroup. They take these towns and they fall back and regroup. Yes, it is true. McCurris is right. If the U.S. empire would blow the bridges, these Ukrainian troops would be cut off, but they'd still be kind of dispersed on this side of the river, right? But they'd be cut off. They'd be in deep and serious trouble. But the West would know what the Russians' plan is now, right? What happens if the Russians say we ain't blowing the bridges? You ain't gonna know what we're doing, and they keep advancing, and the Ukrainian troops fall back, right? Fall back until you get them to fall back all the way up against the river. Then you blow the bridges. And now you've got them trapped. If you want to blow the bridges, you've got them trapped on the river with the river at their back and with your troops at the other, and you can destroy them. Or you can say, look, if you want to talk now, as Nixon said, right? What did Nixon say? The time to negotiate is when you've got your adversary on the floor with your foot on his neck. So then they say, okay, we got your troops all backed up. What do you want to do? You got 24 hours. We're going to start destroying them. Here's what we want. Sign it. You got 24 hours to sign this. If you don't, then it's it for the curtains for these troops. Or they can just blow, Now, the thing about it is this, too. I can make an argument where the Russians don't ever want to blow the bridges, because here's the thing. If the bridges aren't blown, the Russians have options. Should they decide to cross those bridges? Should they decide to move up to the Dnieper? What happens if they don't blow the bridges? You don't know if they want to go into the West and take part of the West. You have to, if they blow the bridges, if the Russians blow the bridges on the Dnieper, the number of things that NATO has to prepare for, the number of scenarios that NATO has to prepare for is dramatically reduced. Well, we know they're not going to use the bridges to go into Western Ukraine and do some stuff over there. So that's out. So therefore, we can plan this, and this, right? But if you leave the bridges, they always got to wonder, what the hell are they up to? Why haven't they blown the bridges? What the hell are they going to cross the bridges or not going to cross the bridges? Are they going to wait till the troops get trapped up against the Dnieper, then blow the bridges and take them all out while they're all focused and concentrated and wondering, oh my God, what are they going to do? So strategically speaking, good idea. Leave the bridges intact. And either the Russians have already made a decision what they're going to do, or they can make a decision later. The other thing is this. Let's say NATO troops come in, right? You can blow the bridges then, and you can say, you guys can't come in here across the bridge, right? I mean, you got any number of things you're doing. So I think the Russians have a number of scenarios. I think they have a number of contingency plans, and some of the contingency plans involve blowing the bridges and some of them don't. So they're going to leave themselves the options. But I think we're rapidly getting to a point where, I'll put it like this. We're rapidly getting to a point in chess where you're sitting there and you know 3 moves and this is over. If I move here, he's going to do that, checkmate. If I move here, he's going to do that. Then I can only do this, checkmate. If he does this, if I take this man, then he comes here and takes that person. If I move here, if any of these guys, boom, checkmate. At that point, the game's over. You're looking at there's no way out, and you know it's a checkmate. Turn the board over, start over again. You've lost or won, depending on which side of that game you're on, right? Okay. And I think that there comes a time here, and we're getting close to it, maybe a month out, where it's turn the board over time on the Ukrainian military, where the leaders of the Ukrainian military, where the soldiers in the Ukrainian military all look, I mean, we're already kind of there. When you have soldiers who are told, respond to Avdiivka, and they say, you think I'm going to go in there, suicide trap and get killed? Not happening. And you say to some other soldiers, okay, we want you to stay here and defend these lines. And they're like, you think I'm going to stand here against 50,000 Russians charging forward with tanks? Not happening, dude. I'm out. Gone. Right? Which means now we're already at a point where some of the Ukrainian troops are starting to turn the board over. They're starting to say, you can give me orders, but if I do this, checkmate. If I do that, checkmate. If I do this, checkmate. This game's over. I think I will just go back to the back lines and think about what I'm doing again. Dying ain't no way to make a living, buddy. Dying ain't no way to make a living. And they're going back, not just dying. Think about this. Dying in futility. It's one thing if you're like, I'm protecting my country, defending my country. But now it's like, I'm going to die and we're going to lose anyway. Think about that. I'm going to die and we're still going to lose. Well, if we're going to lose, I might as well live as die. It don't matter. You know, at that point, I might as well live. If dying is not going to make a difference, if I can't die for my country to save my country, I'm just going to die in futility and we're going to lose anyway. I might as well give up. I might as well call it quits. I might as well stop fighting. What am I fighting for at this point? Not for my country, because my country's already lost. Turn the board over. Turn the board over. And some Russian, some of these Ukrainian troops are already starting to turn that damn board over, and I don't blame them. So the point becomes this. You're going to send troops in to help a defeated military. Think about this. Those troops that were told to hold their ground that backed up, right? And let's say a bunch of French troops came in and said, all right, we're Frenchmen here. Let's go back to the front. Hell, we're trying to retreat so we won't get killed. Yes, we're here. We sent 2,000 Frenchmen and we're going to want to go back to Avdiivka to knock these Russians down. And they're like, dude, we got 40,000 people. And we damn near got surrounded. We're running for our freaking lives. If you want to go back to Avdiivka and confront the Russians with 2,000 French freaking baguette-eating bastards, you just go right ahead. In fact, here's my truck. That way to the front, buddy. Have a good time. We'll be heading back towards Kiev, trying to live. You're going to have a point where if the NATO soldiers came in to assist, fight with, and support the Ukrainian soldiers would say, no, 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 you can replace us. We're heading back for the back. And once and as what we've got now is like dominoes, town after town after town. What's this one called? Ochoretino, whatever it is falling. That's just today. You know, by Tuesday or Wednesday, some other friggin' town that you can't pronounce will be falling. Hey, Robotina. You know, we'll find, whatever, right? I don't know the names of these damn towns. Severodonetsk, whatever, right? You know good and damn well, as do I, as do the Ukrainian soldiers, that by the end of this week, there'll be several other towns which we cannot possibly pronounce that will have fallen or will be ready to fall, and the soldiers will be surrounded. We'll hear about another cauldron forming, other soldiers getting surrounded, running for their freaking lives. Hey, they ain't going to keep doing that, man. At some point, they're going to be like, hey, I see a pattern here. And the pattern is checkmate. Turn the board over. We're going to the back. And what eventually happens is that you don't have enough. You know, I'll put it like this, where there's been instances where you ever go to the dentist. I think I've had a tooth removed or something once, where I had a cavity or something's cracked and broke, whatever. And the dentist looked in it and I said, well, can I get a fill in? And he's like, how about a crown? And he looked at it and he said, to be honest, Garland, it cracked, it broke. There ain't enough left to save. I got to yank this thing out. There's not enough of the basic structure of the tooth left to rebuild. This was years ago. I forgot where the damn tooth is. Believe it or not, when you get a tooth, actually the other ones kind of grow together and take up the space, right? So it's not even like I got a missing tooth there anymore. I mean, it had a lot of years ago that this happened. At any rate, my point is that that's the future of the Ukrainian military. The future of the Ukrainian military is there ain't going to be enough structure left to support. So the option for NATO would now be to flip this. Think about this. There's a reason they use proxy wars, because the people at home will not tolerate body bags coming in. The people at home will not tolerate the people, all their sons and daughters coming home dead in a casket with a flag draped over it, right? The people at home ain't for that, because you haven't ever really made the point to them that this is their fight, because it ain't their fight. Nobody's invading them. Nobody's coming after them. So because you can't make the case to the people of these countries that this is their fight, then they're not willing to sacrifice their sons and daughters for a fight that they have not been convinced is theirs. So now You got find another way. You use ISIS. You use what other people call vanilla ISIS, which would be the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. You use some far extremist proxy force that you have trained and armed. That's got Third Reich insignia tattoos all over them. You use them. You use your fake ISIS that you use to attack your adversaries. You use these kind of things, but your people don't want their kids coming home in body bags. Why? Because they haven't been convinced this is their fight. Why? Because it ain't their fight, and you can't convince them it's their fight. You can give them a whole lot of propaganda, but you can't convince them that it's their fight, because it really isn't. It really isn't. So now you're trapped between two things, the ruling elite, and that is trapped between a Ukrainian army that, shall we say, isn't going to be all that motivated, knowing that they're losing and they're going to lose, and they've been fighting for 2 years without a respite, and losing and getting wiped out and killed, and their legs blown off, and the whole country's falling apart, and the country's being impoverished. The country is a basket case. So this is what you have: a very shaky political platform, wherein any given day Zelensky could get overthrown within weeks. Now, the 21st of May, his legitimacy as the leader of Ukraine will be greatly in question. I always felt he was an installed puppet in the first place, but this is going to make it pretty clear, because he's outlawed the other political parties, and technically his reign of terror will be gone. I mean, let's not forget, the U.S. had an election during the Civil War. The U.S. had an election during World War II. Wars have never stopped us from having an election. So it seems kind of odd that Ukraine's saying we can't have an election because of a war. It's not the war that they can't have an election. They can't have an election because the people will pick somebody, because they can't have democracy, because the people are sick of war, and the people are going to say, we want to vote for somebody who says no war. And they want to give us Joe Biden they want to give them what they give us, Biden versus Trump. That's what they want to give them. Right? Obama versus McCain, Obama versus Romney, some things that look different, but they aren't. Things that appear on the surface to be different, but down below, they're the exact same thing. If they had their way, they give that to Ukraine, and the Ukrainians probably wouldn't bite that hook too well right now. So they can't have an election in Ukraine, but they'll continue saying they're defending democracy. But they're in a jam. And the big part of the jam, I think, is that the Ukrainian, put it here like this. In the same way that I said the ruling elite's great fear in the United States is internal collapse, likewise, the great fear of all ruling elites are internal uprisings and internal collapse, right? That's who cut your head off, your own people who are hungry and tired. And the fear of Zelensky, he can't have an election because it will be the equivalent of an internal uprising. And people will vote against him, and they'll vote for someone. I don't want to use the word more moderate, because Zelensky ain't in charge. They didn't vote him in. They were they were lied into defrauding a puppet in. So now they're going to want somebody that ain't a puppet. So now how is the U.S. empire going to hold an election, and they're going to have to put a couple puppets in? And what happens if one of the puppets ends up not being a puppet? They can't take that chance. So they're just not going to have an election ever. Ukraine, forget it. Zelensky's your dictator for life, which right now, life ain't going to be all that long. Maybe not for Zelensky. I might add. As I said, he knows too much. He knows too much for the U.S. empire. The Russians would love to have Zelensky alive because they'd like to question him and find out everything he knows. So the Russians don't want Zelensky dead because he has all the information they could ever possibly need about what happened in Ukraine, should he decide. And he, as a rat that he is, if they put a gun to his head and scared him, he'd talk. Right? So the Russians would love to have him alive. The neocons can't let that happen now, can they? They can't let Zelensky fall into the hands of Russians alive because he might decide to talk. The Russians may say, we can work out a deal, dude. You give us everything we need and we won't kill you. So he might decide to take that deal. Well, let's face it, he ain't got a lot to bargain with. So right now where we are is it's important to look at um, the foundation of this video, which is this. The foundation of this video: Ukraine's towns are falling like dominoes, one after the other. That dude, they don't have limitless towns. When the towns start falling one after the other, it ain't like they can make new towns. Well, we lost 10 towns. What do you do? Build 10 more. That'll slow the Russians up. No, you lost 10 towns. How many towns have we got? 37. Let's calculate how long that would take for the Russians to take the other 27 towns. The problem is this. I'm just making that number up, 37 towns. But let's say there was 30 towns that the Russians had to take to get to the Dnieper River. The first 5, 10 are going to be the most heavily fortified. It gets easier. So as they take out the most heavily fortified towns, the strategic communication hubs, the strategic resupply hubs, right? As they take out the critical towns, it's not like, okay, each town takes exactly 2.7 days. So let's multiply 2.7 days by 27 towns. That'll tell us how. No. The first towns are the most heavily fortified and the most critical towns. Once you take them out, it comes to a point where, let's say you take the first 10 and the other 17 fall on their own, and everybody jumps out of those towns and runs for their lives because they can't defend them. At some point, when you take out the most heavily fortified towns in areas and villages, fortified areas, when you take out the most important ones, the rest of them got nothing. The Ukrainians got nothing to fall back. Okay, guys, fall back. All right, to what? I don't know. Just keep running. The Russians are chasing you and they're shooting at you. Ain't nothing to fall back to. Hey, do we have any trenches? Nah, I didn't have time to dig any. All right. How about some big buildings? Nah, just keep running. Running is a plan. Actually, running ain't a plan. Running's what you do when a plan don't work. Okay. And that's what they're doing now. They're kind of caught up in a jam. And now we'll just watch the daily, Alexander Mercouris. One thing about him, he can pronounce those towns. I got to give it to him. He can pronounce the towns. So you got to watch Alexander Mercouris so you can find out which towns fell. Maybe you can look on a map and stuff like that. And you start to notice we're getting to a point where the board will have to be turned over. And the Ukrainians are going to be the ones to turn it over. The loser usually turns it over. If it's chess, right? And you got a loser and a winner. The winner ain't turning it over because he wants to get the good feel and he wants that dopamine rush of the checkmate, right? So the loser goes, okay, king, queen, bishop. Can't do that. All right. I'm going to move a pawn here, but then you're going to come around here with your knight, but then your rook is exposed. But then if I take your rook, boom, right into my queen. Crap, both my rooks are gone. And he just keeps looking over the board. And after a while, he looks up from the board and his opponent's just sitting there grinning. And he winks at him. Because he knows. You can look back down at the board if you want to. You can look over it for hours if you want to. You can think about all the moves you might make or you could make or possible strategies you could use. But the other guy just sitting there winking at you because he knows. And what does the loser do at some point? Damn it! Whap! And he hits the board up in the air and the pieces fly all overboard. And the winner just stands up and goes over and gets his trophy. He knew what was happening. It's always the loser that overturns the board. The winner don't need to turn over the board. He's good winning. He actually says, don't turn the board over. Just make that move. I want to say the word checkmate. And you go, click, and he goes, checkmate. You go, boom, and you turn the board over, right? The loser's going to turn the board over at some point. And they're just like, we're out. See you. We're done. Okay, we're going to run across the Dnieper River. Well, we can go across these bridges, and we will hope that the Russians don't follow. I don't think people say the Russians are going to take Odessa. Well, here's what I think. They'll cut Odessa off. I think they'll cut Odessa off. They will put Odessa in distress. I think at some point the West will be like, we've got to go in and protect Odessa. Yeah, how are you going to get there? And what are you going to do when you get there? Well, think about this. The Russians will be able to cut Odessa off. So what they cut it off. So somehow you get a bunch of troops in a town that's cut off behind enemy lines. Yeah, that ain't an assignment I want. Hey, the Russians have cut off Odessa. What are you going to do? Let's put in a bunch of troops. And if I was those troops, I'd be like, how just so we're going to Odessa, right? Yeah. At some point, aren't we going to need like ammunition and food? Yeah. And how are you going to get it to us? Oh, we can't because the Russians have cut it off. I got an idea. Why don't you go to Odessa and I'll stay here and eat friggin' baguettes in the suburbs of Paris? I don't want to go to Odessa. I'll be cut off as soon as I get there. That's not a good military plan. Perhaps we need another plan. Perhaps diplomacy might be an option. But sending me behind enemy lines to Odessa that's already been cut off by the Russians. They don't have to attack it. They cut it off. Already been cut off by the Russians. That's being bombarded. We're cut off and we're being bombarded at the same time. Yeah, sending troops there is probably not a very good option. So we shall see what happens. But that's all I got to say. All right, let's go here. Let us see. Let us look. We're going to look at the, we always get great questions. Conan, thank you, brother. Oh, I'm just yawning because I'm tired. I had a very, very busy day. Let me tell you about that. I was supposed to sleep late, and then my daughter calls me at like 8 o'clock in the morning. She's supposed to be having a party at her house, and all these people are coming, and a big bucket of paint, a gallon of paint spilled in the garage with stuff all over the place, and people are part of the parties in the garage. And so, you know what dad's job is? To come over and clean spilled latex paint. 4.5 hours of work. All right, so that's and then you know, so one thing after another. So my day of resting and relaxing and letting my poor little bad back heal didn't exactly work out like I wanted. So I decided to come out and hang out with my friends and get some fun this evening. Thanks a lot, friends. Pro 86 says, regarding your awesome episode with Jody, is her argument that Lenin was a good type of communist, that Trotsky was bad? What about Stalin, and how does she explain the gulags? Thanks in advance. I will forward this to her. Look, the Trotskyites, think about it realistically. The Newlands and those people are Trotskyites. The whole Trotsky thing was to like a never-ending war. We're going to go around the world and we're going to have a revolution worldwide through eternal war. And like the other Lenin and those people were not down with that. And if you look at the Newlands and those kind of people, they're Trotskyites, right? But at any rate, so we'll throw this to we'll throw some of this stuff to Jody. She's great. She's brilliant. A lot of fun to listen to her. Historically, everything. She's a blast. She's really cool. I have a song to dedicate to U.S. Empire Decline. It's so hard to say goodbye to yesterday. Boys, men to men. There we go. And old Tony Blinken's making a monkey out of himself these days. And it's that fun to watch. This guy going to China making an idiot out of himself. A buffoon. Buffoonery. Conan. Thanks a lot, Conan. Conan the Barbarian is out there doing his thing. I think that's it all. All right, let me look at Rockfin, see if somebody had to say something on Rockfin. Let us go. Ooh, a couple people on Rockfin. RJ says, didn't say anything. Thank you from Dave Burt. Thank you, Dave. Do you think Israel is putting us versus Russia? I think Israel is trapped. Let me say something. I'm glad you brought that up. Since I'm towards the end, let me throw something in there. I got a couple minutes left. Somebody said to me, Politico is reporting that these protests on these college campuses are funded by Soros. What do you think? And I'm like, well, let's see. Politico is reporting it. So here's the way it works. Historically, Soros et al. Fund the Maidan coup protest. And we say, hey, we think that's Soros. And Politico says, no, it isn't. Then Soros funds some protest in Tehran. And we say, hey, we think that's Soros. And Politico says, no, it isn't. You crazy conspiracy theory, Russian bot loving people. And then Georgia. We're like, those look like Soros' color revolution protests in Georgia. And Politico says, no, it's not. How dare you accuse him, you Russian-loving anti-Semite, you. Politico's job is to tell us that it's not George Soros who's involved in these color revolutions when it is. But this time, they tell us it is George Soros. I didn't believe them when they said it wasn't George Soros And I don't believe them when they say it is. If this was Soros, Politico's job would be to say it isn't. Their job, if this was a Soros color revolution style protest, the job of Politico is to say, oh no, Soros is not involved in any way. Let me tell you what's going on. Let me add this, one other thing. I'm supposed to believe that the United States government is brutally putting down Soros-sponsored protests. I'm supposed to believe that Soros is sponsoring protests, and the U.S. government is brutally beating the hell out of it, stopping it, putting snipers on the roof, because the U.S. government wants to stop these Soros-sponsored protests. You got to be pretty naive to believe that. Let me be straightforward. Politico is very consistent. They were lying when they told us that Georgia and Maidan and Tehran and Cuba and wherever, Venezuela, whoever, they were lying when they told us that those were not Soros-sponsored protests. And they're lying now, telling us that they are. What they do is lie. That's what they do. No, what they're trying to do is this. They're trying to damage the protest. They know good and damn well that there's a lot of people out here that as soon as they hear Soros, oh, I knew it. They're not genuine. They're not organic. They're all Soros. They know there's a whole lot of people that will support the protesters until they hear the word Soros. And then the people go, oh, wait a minute. I was supporting this. You mean it's a Soros? Well, oh, okay, time out. Let's oppose. Boo! Down with the protesters. I'm joining Biden. I'm joining Newland. I'm joining Blinken. I'm joining all of the neocons, because Newland and Biden and Blinken and Hillary Clinton, they're all trying to stop these Soros protests. You really believe that, huh? You really believe that Blinken and Biden are trying to stop, brutally repress these George Soros-sponsored protests? You are a sap if you believe that. Politico's job is to lie. They're trying to discount the protests. These protests are organic, and they're trying to make them look bad. And they're smart. These people aren't stupid. They're slick. They know good and damn well. First, they tried. They're anti-Semites. And we're like, cut out of here with that. Half of the people there are Jews. For God's sake, I look there, they're running around with friggin' yarmulkes having a Seder. And there's like rabbis running around, these guys with like the old ancient Jewish clothes. And they're like, they're anti-Semites. I'm like, well, they don't look like innocent. What the hell? Jewish anti-Semites? So then they're like, oh, crap, that ain't working. And they got to whisper, what do you say we do there, Mr. CIA officer who's sitting in the Politico's offices helping write the stories? Well, we call them anti-Semites. Crap, that didn't work. I got an idea. These people out here hate Soros. Maybe this is good. This is just brilliant. Why didn't I think of this earlier? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to double cross them. We're going to tell them that these protests are Soros sponsored. And then they'll say, oh, I should have known. We can get them to oppose any protest. All we got to say is that they're Soros sponsored. Great. What are you going to do? Should we write an article, Mr. CIA guy who works right here in the offices of Politico? Nah, I'll write it myself. Click, click, click. Yes, they're Soros sponsored, and Soros. And God, you know, Biden and Blinken and those guys would never go along. They would always brutally repress a Soros sponsored. These are Soros sponsored. And these people out here reading it like, oh, Politico has given me a scoop. Well, if you think Politico is giving you a scoop, yeah, already going down the wrong road. Hell no, Soros sponsored, and the government's trying to put it down. Let me tell you something. If these were Soros sponsored, they would be. Now, I'll say this. Oh, there's some Soros sponsored out there. You know, these people that are like former IDF that are like spraying skunk juice on the protesters, fighting the protesters, carrying Israeli flags. Then you get like some agent provocateur screaming, I hate the Jews or something like that, pretending they're one of the protesters. Oh, they're Soros sponsored, all right. But the protesters ain't. And if you're naive enough to believe that Politico is trying to help you out and that Biden is working with you, man, because he doesn't want them, that Biden is going to brutally repress those Soros-sponsored protests, you're probably watching the wrong video, to be honest. If you believe that, you're probably watching the wrong channel. You need to go watch, to go to CIA.gov to get your information if you believe that one. All right. Thanks a lot, you all. I'm going to make my move and get a little bit of rest and get ready for the week tomorrow. Thanks a lot, you all. My back's feeling better. You know, I got a bad back, you know, it's many car accidents and all kind of stuff. And I'm going to lay back down. I put some ice on my back. My back is feeling better. And maybe one of these days I'll get a day when I can rest, huh? But meanwhile, I'm going to hang out with you guys every opportunity I get. Thanks a lot. Peace. I'm out.